Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a newcomer into the temple. Our first entry from the weird and wonderful world of Catalyst, the lead developer of the Voltron role-playing game and board game. We're gonna be talking about the role-playing game, of course, here.
I actually did do the board game.
Yeah, the one and only Jason Hardy. How you doing today, man?
Good, thanks for having me.
Out of respect, I will refrain from any Hardy jokes, any jokes about the Hardy Boys, the detectives, not the wrestlers. Any jokes I could make, because one, you've probably heard that joke way too many times already, and two, that's too easy.
I have heard them a number of times. I did like the Hardy Boys a lot growing up, though.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the traditions around here is getting into the humble beginnings, in a sense. So, walk me through your first introduction to role-playing games and what made it stick.
First introduction to role-playing games was when my friend Tom said, I heard about this game where you can play like you're a knight going on quests and it just goes on forever. You don't win the game, you just keep playing and conquering monsters as long as you want. And I'm like, that sounds pretty awesome. We should find a way to play that. And so he got the red box of Dungeons and Dragons, and just the two of us played and, colored in the numbers with the black crayon included in the box.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started playing that, and what made it stick is because I could tell any number of stories that I wanted to tell. It was just infinite creativity. So I could make a fighter. My first character was a fighter. I eventually made a bard. I've had about 1 billion rogues through my lifetime, and just the ability to sit down with a group of people and watch a story unfold and laugh like crazy is addictive.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. I've played my fair share of rogues, although most of them are less of the steal stuff and more of the set up elaborate traps like this is a Chuck Jones cartoon.
That's always good. Mine tend to be the shoot an arrow and make sarcastic remarks type of rogues.
Yeah. One of my more infamous things was a trap I devised called the up button, which you step on the thing, you go up. that's pretty much.
I mean, at least it's labeled properly.
Yeah, you're going up about 40 miles an hour for about 6 seconds.
That does sound very Chuck Jones-ish.
Yeah, the culmination was when a dragon stepped on the thing while it was in a cave lined with adamantite, which, if anyone knows anything about adamantite, you know that's not moving for anybody.
Yeah.
And the GM's like, alright, he hits the ceiling, then he comes back down. I was like, no, he doesn't. It hasn't been 6 seconds. He was like, that's adamantite, it's not gonna move. It's like, the spell does not care. The spell says you go up. There's no if something's in the way exception. You go up until the time's up.
Go up.
And when you have an unstoppable force of an immovable object, well, you ever see a car get stuck in a compactor?
You at very least get a loud crunching sound.
Yeah, and a whole lot of chunky salsa, but on the plus side, meat's back on the menu.
Yeah, plenty of it. A little scaly, but whatever.
Mm-hmm. A little scaly. Everybody had to roll saves to avoid projectile vomiting because they just saw all of that chunky salsa and got sprayed.
And probably avoid falling chunks because that's going to rain all over.
Yeah. But it's more the smell. But,
yeah, that would be bad too. I haven't, smelled the inside of a dragon for too much, thankfully, but I imagine it's pretty bad.
He described it as a tannery on steroids, and as somebody who's been in a tannery, that is a horrifying thought.
Yeah, they're not good.
It was part of a work. It was part of this group thing when I was younger, and some of the people could not handle the smell and had to run out.
That's a good visceral experience for that game master. Well done.
Mm-hmm. Uh, I think it was because he figured out that I technically had outwitted him, but he wanted to get me back in some way. Because him and I have a bit of a frenemy relationship of both of us finding new and interesting ways to drive each other crazy.
That is a role-playing dynamic that happens.
And I've taken that into my own way, because whenever somebody does something ridiculously stupid or gets caught cheating, they have to drink the pain glass. Either that or drink a bottle of baking soda.
Well, I've had baking soda before, and it is not comfortable.
No, that's the whole point. Make the punishment worse.
I would
than the
figure,
crime.
yeah. It's not good stuff. I'd avoid it.
Yeah, the pain glass is just a shot glass filled with water, salt, sea salt, pepper, and about 5 different hot sauces you might find on Hot Ones.
I'd probably still take the baking soda then.
Most people do. But I've only had to use the thing maybe 5 times over the last 20+ years, because
Shows its effectiveness as a deterrent.
Yeah, well, that was the whole point. Make the punishment so vile that nobody would want to test their luck. But
That'll do it.
so now, obviously with this Voltron project, it's an interesting move to be doing 2 books, one covering the OG Defender of the Universe, one covering Legendary Defender. How did you approach DreamWorks at all with the idea of doing this? How did the chain of events happen to get this off the ground?
Heard that it was available. I mean, what tends to happen when you're looking at licenses is you just reach out to all the companies and see, who's interested in doing what, and if they have a property you're interested in, then you're like, okay, let's try to get that one. And when we heard Voltron was a possibility to get, we absolutely wanted to chase after it because it seemed like it would be a fantastic role-playing game. And also, as Catalyst Game Labs, we're already in the business of big stompy robots, so we want to, extend that line and make sure we get all the big stompy robots in our games.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked to NBC Universal, is actually the company we approached about the license. And, the relationships are always complicated to me as someone who came from Shadowrun. You think I'd be used to complicated licenses, but I still don't know all the ins and outs of who owns what. Because we talk to NBC Universal, they talk to the franchise people, and make sure everything works out. But it turns out that Defender of the Universe and Legendary Defender have some separation in ownership. So they are, in many ways, 2 separate properties. So we couldn't combine them. We did talk some about the possibility of, well, what if we did like a book that was Defender of the Universe on one side, Legendary Defender on the other, and you flipped it over and you could have both books, and that would be kind of fun. But that was a non-starter because there's just separation between the properties and they do not combine like that. So that meant we wanted to do 2 books because we certainly did not want to have to pick or choose one of them. Because if we're going to do Voltron, I want all Voltron fans to have access to the Voltron they love, so that meant doing both of them.
Mm-hmm. Which ultimately is a smart move, since the original Defender of the Universe and Legendary Defender are 2 different energies, for lack of a better term. And if you tried to mix them or went with one or the other, you probably would have ended up with the same problem that happened with that Power Rangers RPG from a while back, or just any of the ones using that Essence 20 system from Hasbro.
To make one system or one book to make everyone happy, we'd end up making no one happy.
Yeah. I didn't cover the G.I. Joe and Transformers RPGs back back when they came out, but I did cover the Power Rangers one, and how that one had the problem of saying, oh, you can use this to run any Power Rangers campaign, but it clearly skews towards the very early days, and you've got like 3 or 4 different eras to account for. Let alone
It's a complication.
Yeah, and obviously when you're dealing with multiple lines, multiple eras. There's a whole lot of cooks in the kitchen, but it's one of those things where people are going to come at this from different directions, and that's something that has to. I'm not saying it has to be directly brought in, but it's an elephant in the room that has to be addressed because it's sitting on the couch.
Yeah, and that's going to happen with Voltron, because, are you talking about the Paladins from Season 1, or you're talking about the Paladins from the last season? And that's a different situation, so we are going to have to address that even within just like the Legendary Defender books. We have to talk about what area we're talking about and what stats, the stats we're giving for Shiro are for early Shiro, not later.
And obviously, this is nothing new when you're dealing with adapting any sort of long-running IP. I mean,
correct. Always some, you always have to take into account what the canon is and how you can adapt to it.
That, and one other problem that can happen is giving wiggle room for letting people input their own characters into the concept. I've seen some approaches that kind of skim on that, where they just I think one of the worst cases was that Indiana Jones game TSR made back in the day, where it just assumed you'd be playing as the cast from the movies.
Yeah, I think it's a bigger problem with a property like that when Indiana Jones is kind of the front and center thing. So a lot of people are going to play Indiana Jones, and that's what the book might assume. But I can see that other players would be like, no, I want to make up my own explorer, adventurer, architect, also, or archaeologist, awesome person.
Yeah.
And so that's what Voltron, I think, is a little easier to be more open, because the thing everyone wants to do in Voltron is form Voltron, but we have ample proof that it doesn't have to be one group of 5 people to form Voltron. It can be a different assortment of 5 people. So whether it's the 5 people that were in this part of the TV show, or the 5 people that are in another part of the TV show, or 5 people that you make up as players, that can all work pretty easily to form Voltron, and we're not quite as constrained by like having to have Indiana Jones or like a Doctor Who role-playing game. You kind of have to have the Doctor in there, or else it's a kind of strange game.
Yeah, I do remember when my group had approached me about doing Doctor Who, and I said, I am not doing it because somebody's going to argue about who's going to be a Time Lord or not. And I'm also reminded of a bit of a story with the Star Wars Galaxies MMO back in the day, on how Ralph Koster, who his work I really do admire, was insistent on not having Jedi in the game because he felt they would be an alpha class everybody would chase. And since this was a sandbox style MMO where a lot of the economy is user built, if everybody's chasing this one archetype, that could create a problem.
And I think that's a reasonable assertion to make. I think it's also a little bit of a problem, because doing Star Wars without having a Jedi does feel like it's missing an important piece. But Jedi are set up in that universe to be the real cool thing, so it's tough to not have a lot of players wanting to be the real cool thing.
Yeah. Now, with the setup that you have, I'll get one thing out of the way. I'm assuming that whether someone's picking up Defender of the Universe or Legendary Defender, the core mechanics and alongside character creation, encounters, all that is consistent through both of the books, right?
Correct.
So that brings me to the die system that you guys ended up coming up with. This die size based approach of, I guess I'll call it the feat pool, unless there's a better name for it that I haven't been.
System dice core for short. So
SDS. All right. So it is definitely an interesting approach of doubling down on the different die sizes. What prompted that direction?
So, what actually prompted it was another game that Catalyst released a number of years ago and will be coming back very soon called Leviathans. And one of the cool things Leviathans did was rather than have modifiers, it built the modifiers into changing the dice that you rolled. So you would, instead of getting a +1 or a +2, you'd change effectively a D8 to a D10.
Mm-hmm.
And that just meant less numbers that you had to keep track of in your head when you're just exchanging dice. And so Randall Bills, who's with Catalyst and did a lot of work on Leviathans, and I were both separately thinking about, is there any good way to put that kind of a system into a role-playing game? And so we were just playing around with how could the dice combine in a way that would work for role-playing. Because looking at it, just rolling one die at a time didn't quite work. And so we experimented with some probabilities. And it was at one Gen Con that I had built a spreadsheet, because that's what nerds do, of probabilities of rolling different sizes of dice together in a pool of 3. So, what would it look like if you rolled 2d6s and a d8 versus 2d6s and a d10? And the probability curve with 3 polyhedral dice is actually really nice. It kind of hits a good sweet spot of advancing smoothly, advancing reasonably quickly, but not too quick. And so we really liked the probability curve and then started building from there.
Yeah. And just to catch people up, the approach with the feat pool as it's built when this setup is done is taking a feat die, then 1 die for skill and 1 die for attribute, and any upgrades or downgrades as appropriate to the roll.
Right, so you might get upgrades from your skill or attribute, or you might get it from the situation, or from decisions you made, or sometimes from gear, or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so an upgrade would be like a D8 becomes a D10.
Yeah. And with one exception that we'll get into later, the upgrades and downgrades for these dice are capped at D4 and D12.
Correct.
All right. So one of the things that I did notice when I went through the quick start is the beat die, which is the baseline, is either is for the most part a D8, though there are some actions that use a D6, complex feats. Now I know there's a few entries that are examples of that in the quick start, but from your perspective, what is the dividing line between what would be a standard feat, which uses a D8, and a complex feat?
Something like if you were trying to do a multiple attack rather than a standard attack, that might be a complex feat. There are certain Voltron actions that are complex just because once Voltron is formed up with 5 lions and has 5 people trying to coordinate it, some of the attacks it wants to do are extra complicated. So something that adds just an extra layer of difficulty on top of what a normal action would be.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to health, I did see that you have a wound system. I'm guessing that kind of plays into the upgrade and downgrade setup that was mentioned.
Right, when you get a wound, you're going to downgrade. It'll tell you on your wound track whether you're downgrading a skill or an attribute.
Mm-hmm. Now, if a certain die rolls its maximum, does that create any additional effect, or is that not factored in?
The maximum by itself doesn't necessarily create an effect, but you can have critical successes, which typically is rolling 3 more than your target number. Mm-hmm. So if my target number is 12 and I roll a total of 15, then I'm going to get a critical success. If I roll 18, I'll get 2 critical successes. So if you roll the highest number, you have a better chance of getting more critical successes, which will add extra effects to your roll.
Mm-hmm. So it is essentially a degree of success kind of system.
Yes. And degree of failure, too. So if you go too far under, then you're going to have extra bad things happening.
So I would say pray to the dice gods that you don't roll ones, but they're not listening. Actually, no, that's a lie. They are listening. They're just laughing at you.
They do that a lot to me, yeah.
So, obviously, the quick start didn't get into character creation, but within that part of the system, is character creation more of a point-based affair, or is it more of assigning different die sizes?
Are assigning different die sizes, but you can choose kind of what pool you want, especially for skills. Like the base, and I can't remember the exact number of skills, but I think the base number of skills you choose is 5, and then it will tell you if with those 5 skills, I think you have a D10, a D8, 2 D6s, and a D4 plus upgrade. Don't quote me on that, I could be wrong. But you could also expand that to 6 skills if you wanted a more skilled character, and then you just have like 2 D8s and D6s and a D4 plus upgrade. So you can customize a little bit based on how many skills you want the character to have. Attributes, you're always going to have the 6, and so it'll tell you what values you have, and you just have to assign them to your attributes.
Yeah. Now, most of the attributes are pretty self-explanatory, but there's one that's kind of the exception that I did want to get into, and that is channeling. Since it sounds like you have some special things in mind with how channeling will work compared to the other attributes.
Yeah, channeling's got a lot of cool things tied into it, and this is for Legendary Defender in particular. It will still be called channeling and Defender of the Universe, but Defender of the Universe doesn't use quintessence, so I haven't thought about it as carefully recently because I had to do the quick start rules, and that was Legendary Defender. But it kind of represents how in tune you are with some of the flow of quintessence in the universe and things you can do with that. So for some characters, they'll have quintessence powers, where they'll be able to channel it in a specific way to make effects happen, like ethereal dart or invisibility or things like that. But there's also the ability to use that as an occasional boost to your power. So that based on what your channeling die is, you'll get a certain number, and this isn't in the quick start rules because I had to cut it for space, but it'll be in the full game. Based on what the die is, you'll get a certain number of times when you can actually add a 4th die to your pool, based on how good your die is, and so that will give you a temporary boost for times when you really need it.
I can get that, and there was a bit of a hinting of that in the quick start, and obviously a short list of quintessence abilities in that.
It does have some of the quintessence powers in there. Yeah, I had to cut a few of those too, but there will be more of them in the core book.
And when it comes to advancement, is it a case of directly spending XP like in some freeform affairs?
Yeah, so you'll get XP to get up to the next level, and when you get to a level, then you'll just upgrade. You'll get points to upgrade either skill or...
Oh, so this is a level-based system then?
Basically, yeah. That's the easiest way to get, but it goes pretty quick. I'm trying to remember. We might just have you spend your experience points. Yeah. I haven't looked at the character advancement in a while because that wasn't in the quick start.
Yeah, obviously.
So it might just be using your points to buy.
Yeah, that I refer to that kind of thing as XP as currency, as opposed to a level threshold.
Yeah, I think that's what we're doing now that I remember.
Which would certainly make sense. Now, continuing on from that, this is as good of a spot as any to address another big old elephant in the room, and that is in regard to, Voltron itself. I know that there's certain mechanics that you have, like the formation test, as well as its own powers. But one of the big ones, and this was something that I've seen other games that have combiner mechs struggle with, is how you make it so that each component feels like they are contributing.
Right. So you have 5 individuals who are forming Voltron, and they're going to act with a single action. So that the question you asked is a good one. How does each of them feel involved? So with all of the Voltron tests, you look at a skill and an attribute. Sometimes it's 2 attributes. And on one of them, you're going to look at the lowest one among the paladins, and the other, you'll look at the highest among the paladins. So it'll usually be 2 different paladins contributing dice. And so you're going to want to consider the balance in your team as you advance. And you're going to think of, okay, well, as we get agility, do we want to make sure our best agile person gets even more agility so we can be better when we form Voltron? Do we need to bring up the lowest person so we can bring up our baseline? So you'll be ready for those tests when you form Voltron. And the other part is that anyone can roll that test. It doesn't have to be rolled by the people who contributed the dice to that pool. So if someone's rolling well, even though they didn't have the skill or attribute that's used in the test, give them the dice, let them roll, and see what happens. We have an actual play video up on the Kickstarter, and the team did a really good job of that, of forming their dice pool and then just considering, well, who's rolling well, or who do we think made some really good decisions, and so they deserve to roll for us. And you get to see them just kind of rotate the dice around and act like a team as they play as Voltron.
Yeah. And, of course, this is where I also have to bring up the exception I mentioned earlier when it comes to die sizes, because I believe this is the only case where D20s can come up.
Yes. And that's when we first designed Dice Core, it was just D4 to D12. Because I did some probability curves with the D20, and it's a pretty big jump when you introduce that to the pool. You get a little outsized increase in success, but if you're going to be Voltron, that feels right. So being able to have some extra power as Voltron should happen. So if you do really well on your formation test when you're forming Voltron, you get a certain amount of D20s to use when you choose as Voltron. So then you just get that real extra boost. And again, the actual play video, they nailed their formation roll so hard, they got a bunch of D20s, and then you get to see what they did with them, and they went to town swinging that blazing sword around with their D20s. It was really good.
Now, given that, I'd like to kind of address the other end of the glass. On the GM end of things. Obviously, one of the big things with Voltron, regardless of which end of the spectrum you're going on, is the monsters of the week, whether it be row beasts in the original or something else. So, on the GM side, do you have plans to put in something so that people could customize and make various encounter types?
Probably not right out of the gate. We will have plot hooks in both books so that you can start to design your own campaign. I don't think we'll have specific like build and enemy rules. We'll have lots of stats for like Gara and Robeast and things in the book. But I don't know that we'll have space to talk about how to build your own Robeast, because that's another layer of complication.
Which is understandable. I mean, you are effectively making 2 creation systems when you do that.
Right, and it just the balance you have to worry about gets a little tricky.
Now, I do recall that one of the other elements that you could use to customize characters is gifts. Now,
yes.
With gifts, which seem to be the equivalent of little tricks or feats in certain games, is that something that where most of them would be one-offs? You're not going to have to do a bunch of chaining of gifts when it comes to setting them up or getting new ones.
Too many gifts as a character. You'll start with one. But you won't be adding them a whole lot as you go away, so that's just a way of deciding one thing that your character is particularly good at so that you can give yourself an extra reroll or some little boost with it. So it's a good way of defining your character right at the outset of saying this is where their particular skill really lies.
Yeah. And I'm guessing when it comes to skills, we're not going to be in a Shadowrun-like situation where there's a bunch of different skills per attribute. You know,
Sorry, sound's cutting out on me.
no worries. These things happen.
Yeah, it depends on what edition of Shadowrun you're talking about. We're certainly not at a Shadowrun 5 level of skills. We're closer to Shadowrun 6 level of skills, but probably not quite as long as that list.
Yeah, from the list I saw in the quick start, it's not even at that level.
Yeah, it's a shorter list of skills. We're not trying to parcel everything out into a whole bunch of tasks.
Which, given the nature of this kind of thing, certainly makes sense, and it also means that we're not dealing with a bunch of sub skills to pile onto the skills.
Right.
Which
we call Dice Core a medium weight system because it's not a full narrative system, but it's also not there to try to simulate everything. It's there to help the story move along, but give you some cool dice rolling opportunities as it happens.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to upgrades and downgrades, I think something that needs to be hammered home is that maybe I'm wrong on this, and you can feel free to correct me, but when you have them, what die get upgraded or downgraded is determined by the player or determined by the situation. But more
it's determined by the player. The player will decide which of their dice to downgrade or upgrade. Mm-hmm. So they get to choose. Because we found when we did all the statistical analysis that it makes a small difference. Not a huge difference, but it makes a small difference. So if it does make a difference, we wanted to put the power in the hand of the players. What we found is that if you're going for what you think is a higher target number, you want to upgrade your larger die. And if you're going for a lower target number, you want to upgrade your lower die.
Yeah. Now, obviously, Voltron assumes five lions. So one of the other questions to address is how you'd handle things if you have more or less than 5 players at your particular table.
Yeah, the quick start rules address this to a degree. If you have less, then that's just a matter of the game master filling in a paladin.
Mm-hmm.
You know, having an NPC paladin and probably making that paladin be a low profile through most of the non-Voltron actions and then making sure they're involved when Voltron forms. It's a little easier to do more than 5 because there's plenty of good rolls. If you look at Legendary Defender, you've got Princess Allura from the beginning, and she's not forming Voltron right there, but she still has a very active role to play. Mm-hmm. And if you have someone who is a Quintessence Channeler, then they could play a very useful role alongside Voltron in any situation you get into. Or if you had a noble or some other character, they can certainly be involved in whatever Voltron's up to and functioning alongside them, so that they can be part of the adventure very easily.
Yeah, I can get that. Now, in the development process, were there any concepts that you guys had that you thought were good ideas at the time, but through testing just didn't pan out the way that they were intended?
Yeah, the early versions, and I make a mistake sometimes when I talk about critical successes, is I sometimes still call them phase successes, because that's what the original term was, and attacks were a lot more complicated using, you'd roll your combat, I think, and then you'd roll 3 dice for the weapon as well, to represent how much the weapon contributed to your attack, and then looked at your phase successes to add additional wounds. and we found that combat was really dragging, and people were having to go back and look at their character sheets on and on, and that wasn't the effect we wanted. And if we just simplified it and said that roll your combat skill and linked attribute and feat die, and then the weapon can just give you maybe an upgrade, or the weapon has a certain number of wounds it does, or the weapon has a different number of critical successes, like it might lower the critical success threshold from 3 to 2, so then it's a more effective weapon. That was enough to differentiate the weapons, and it was a lot simpler than having 3 dice connected to the weapons that you had to look up and roll all the time. So that was one subsystem we just did away with.
Yeah. And when it comes to vehicles, I do find it interesting that vehicles, whether it be the Lions or something else, fall into, aside from their weapons, fall into 4 stats: speed, handling, build, and zoom. Was that mainly done to kind of simplify the use of vehicles so that wouldn't drag the way that problem happened with combat?
Exactly. So it does kind of take what combat started to do of having dice attached to the item, but it still makes it simpler rather than having to try to simulate the movement of the vehicle, so you don't have to track exactly where the vehicle is on the map. You can just have the 3 stats that give you the die roll and then know what the speed is, so you have some idea, can I outrun this other vehicle or not? And keep it fast moving and simple rather than trying to simulate every bit of the vehicle's movement.
Yeah, because this isn't a simulation, it's kind of game.
Correct.
Plus, there'd be the ridiculousness of trying to take a simulationist approach to something like Voltron. It just wouldn't work.
But it would get funky if I just thought of trying to calculate Voltron speed. Makes me sad just thinking about it.
Not to mention when you're dealing with that sort of adapting, those sort of stats are not always consistent.
The wonkiness would get high real fast.
I call back to the many incarnations when it comes to certain mechs in BattleTech and how sometimes the stats for some of them, especially older mechs, have changed over the years.
Yeah, sometimes they found out things were working a little too powerfully.
Mm-hmm. Of course, then you have the other ones where somebody finds something stupid that they do with a certain mech, and then that ends up being canonized. I'm looking directly at you, Charger.
Fans are great for that. They find all sorts of interesting things to do.
Mm-hmm. In the fighting game community, there's a term for that known as tech, of those things that people figured out that weren't intended but were kept in anyways. And
yep, it's a good way to learn.
It's a good way to learn, and sometimes a good way to surprise.
Yes, I've been unpleasantly surprised by that sometimes.
I've been pleasantly surprised in some cases and unpleasantly in others. There's a part I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in Bungie's office when BXR started to become a thing. Because if you're not familiar, BXR was an exploit that was discovered in the multiplayer for Halo 2, where the battle rifle, which was supposed to be a jack-of-all-trades gun, became a close-quarters gun, because people figured out a way to cancel the animation after a melee to immediately go to that weapon.
Yeah, especially with computer games, players are good at that stuff.
Mm-hmm. And I've certainly discovered my own accidental combinations and said, this is ridiculous, but screw it, we're going with it anyways. So
yeah, I discover when it's sometimes they're playing Masters and Minions at Gen Con. I'm not the most active BattleTech player, but I've been able to play there, and it's kind of fun. But I see I get a look at the other players' mechs before they go, and it's like, okay, and now I know their stats, and then I see them in action. I'm like, oh, that's why you wanted that mech, and that's what those two numbers together can do. Okay, I've learned a little something more now.
Yeah,
I'm going to be that next time.
I will admit sometimes I will build teams just to troll people. Have nothing but speedy boys just to zip around and say you can't hit me.
My favorite.
And it's like if I want to be a complete asshole, I'll boot up Mech Warrior Online and then pick the Flea because it's hard to touch that thing.
Yeah, it's just every time I get a really good fast mech, someone gets someone with 1 billion points of armor, so I run around and I fire at it, and then my little lasers and small missiles just go pew 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 off their armor, and they laugh at me.
Yeah. Now, in regard to the stretch goals that were added, one of the ones that I wanted to highlight is the introductory adventure. Would that be an introductory adventure in the same style as what you saw in the quick start, or would it be a bit more expansive?
More expansive. It'll be longer than that. That was just a quick built to be a scenario adventure. What we'll write for the stretch goals will be probably something that can be played over multiple sessions.
Yeah. So a mini campaign as opposed to a one shot.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. I could certainly get that. Now, given that, would it be a case where both books would have different introductory adventures?
I imagine there'll be some similarities, but there'll have to be some differences between them just to suit each universe and the stats in it.
Mm-hmm. Which I can certainly get. So with that in mind, I do want to congratulate you guys for the fact that you managed to get funded in less than an hour. I don't know the exact amount of time because I wasn't keeping a stopwatch, and I'm not going to be staring at a screen for hours on end on just one site holding a stopwatch or something.
We did have a stopwatch. We were watching carefully. It was about 59 minutes.
Oh. But what would you guys be shooting for as far as a release window? Not a date per se, but a ballpark, for lack of a better term.
Ballpark second quarter of 2025.
So right around the time that everybody's recovered from what passes for winter in their area, because you and I know that there's some people who have not experienced proper cold.
Yes. I bet anyone who moved to Chicago last year didn't. We had the lightest winter. It was nothing.
The kind of people out in the coast who it gets to 60 degrees and they're putting sweaters on, and I'm just laughing.
Yeah.
Come
up north and learn.
Yeah. In my defense, I'm from Minnesota, so.
Yeah, so you've experienced some stuff.
I was there during that whole polar vortex a few years ago that was so bad I was told to not go into work.
Your face is going to fall off if you go outside.
Screw that. You can't even... It gets that cold, you can't breathe.
Yeah, it's bad.
But, since you're dealing with second quarter, it'll be just around the time of spring and right around the time to see everybody hopeful for their baseball teams to not blow it, and then they do.
Most of them do. I'm a Cubs fan, been there.
Yeah, I'm a Twins fan, and being a fan of sports in Minnesota is varying forms of pain.
I totally get it.
Although I do have to wonder if in the city of Chicago billy goats are banned.
Or we're over that now. 2016 wiped it all away. We're all fine.
Yeah, and in the same vein, I wonder if in parts of Texas trash cans are banned.
It should have been, but oh well.
But well, every story needs a villain. So, For the individual books, what would you be shooting for as far as a page count? Stretch goals notwithstanding, of course.
Yeah, page count around 200. 160 to 200 pages.
Which, I could see that. For something as crunch medium as this, that would certainly make sense. I will.
Yeah, and that's with the goal of keeping it pretty accessible, giving you everything you need to play, but not making it too heavy. And the rules chapter itself is not that long, so we can still put in a lot of good universe information and plot information, and not make the book too thick.
Which is apropos. I remember Stan Lee once saying every comic is someone's first, and to a certain extent, I think that can apply to role-playing games just as much. Because
you never know when people are going to enter the hobby.
Yeah, and it's an easy trap for people to just assume that somebody picking this up is already a fan. They might be a fan, but there are degrees of fandom. You know, there's the person who may have watched Voltron on Saturday mornings a long time ago, and then there's the person who has full models of the whole thing. They're both fans, but to different degrees.
We had a chance to run demos of Voltron at Gamehole Con in Madison, Wisconsin in October. And yeah, saw full levels of different fandom. I saw, people who were passionate Defenders of the Universe fans, people who were passionate Legendary Defenders fan, and then other people were like, oh yeah, I remember this, what's this like? And other people who said, Voltron, what's Voltron? Well, let me show you. So it was all across the board of people we got to run demos for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've gotten on. I won't go into specifics, but I've gotten on some designers for assuming too much. I'll put it that way. But with that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple and enjoy the madness that happens around here.
My pleasure.
Mm-hmm. And anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged.
Well, I appreciate that. We've got plenty more games in the pipeline, so I'd be happy to talk about them in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there'll be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.